All right, so here's the plan for this week. Today, I'm going to go over chapter 15, just 15, what I prepared for you, and I sent you an email on this morning. It may not make a whole heck of a lot of sense, but it's about 300 lines where I created about 30 examples of some of the uses of these different array methods. And I'm going to have to show you how to do this because, you know, so much of it, when you want to try one, you got to comment out a bunch of stuff. So I'll show you that in just a bit. But I'm going to take my time going over chapter 15, okay? Then tomorrow, we're going to do the same thing with chapter 16, which is on object-oriented programming, all right? So again, we'll go over it nice and slow, okay? And then what's going to be left is going to be 17 and 18. All right, and we're going to finish that this week, and we should still have some time where we can start going through a couple of examples. What I'm looking at doing right now, in an ideal world, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But I'm hoping that we can get to the point by the end of the week that I can give you your test on this stuff. If we don't, because I know where I want to get with this. If we don't get that far, then you'll have the test, and when you come back in on Tuesday. Now, don't worry about studying for it. If you've gone through the stuff and if you've listened when I've done all the lectures, you should be okay. And there's a good chance I'm going to give you 2 class periods to work on it. All right, so you should have plenty of time if you need that much time. You very well might not need that much time. There's 2 questions on 2 problems that you have to do. All right, so again, I'm on chapter 15. Now, they gave me I'm now using Red Shelf instead of VitalSource, okay? And it appears to be, so far, watch what I say, but so far it's working a lot better. I got a hold of them. I couldn't believe it. She my rep over there, Judy, she's like, yeah, there's 4 people meeting today seeing whether or not we can give you a PDF. And I'm like, this is ridiculous. And I kind of told her that, but not in a mean way, and she said, hey, we also have another contractor other than VitalSource, and it's called Red Shelf. If you want to try setting up an account with them and seeing if it works any better. Well, I played with this a lot this weekend, and it worked okay. It didn't go down at all. So I'm hoping that it's going to be the same way here. All right? I guess we'll see. So some of this stuff with arrays you've already had. You should know how to create and use an array. Now, with these methods that modify, remove, etc. Some of them you've seen, some of them you may not have seen. I don't know. All right? But then after that, we're how to split a string and make a copy and do all this other stuff. Again, some of that you've seen, some of that you have not seen. I'm not going to be going through the examples that are in here, like the task list and that. All right? But what you'll do on the test is nothing like that, so I don't really see the need for doing that. Again, when you take your tests, they'll be open book, open notes, as they've always been. All right? And then we conclude the chapter, as it says, they're talking about sets and maps. I didn't give you really any examples on sets and maps, but we'll look at the ones that are in here. You know that like any other programming language, that arrays in this language are zero-based. Now, there's 3 ways that you can actually create an array, and they're shown on the top of page 463 and on the top of the screen. I didn't even know that second way existed within array.of. I've never used that before, and I don't plan on using it now. All right? So typically, for example, one of the things that you're going to be looking at in just a little bit, and this is the one that we're working on. But if you look, I've got a bunch of arrays in here, but one of the arrays that I have on the second part, where is right here, and it's pretty simple. So let me grab that and open up a new window in here. All right, now I'm going to put this on multiple lines. You typically wouldn't do this, all right, but I'm going to do it just so I have enough room. All right. Now, remember that when you used const with an array, you can repeat, C-A-N, you can change these values. You cannot change the size of the array. like you can do in quote regular JavaScript, where you can make it bigger, smaller. You can't do that here because it's now a constant size, and I don't know how many numbers are in there. Let's just say that it's 12, okay? So it's always going to be of size 12. The example that's in there, the reason that that's used is I just threw up a dozen or so. Maybe there's more than that. I don't care. 10 to 15 pretty random numbers. And I wanted them all to be between 0 and 9, really 1 and 99. All right? And the way that it's going to be used is we're going to make an array out of that, off of these numbers called can you vote. And as you'd guess, if the person is 18 or above, they can vote. Otherwise, they can't vote. Now, again, looking at what was just shown, I'm not going to run through this, but you could use any of those things, any of those three ways to create it. All right? Any of them would work. Okay. Now, one thing is almost always in JavaScript where they show the first one, the reason that most people don't use that top one that they show there is it is expecting a length. Now remember that by default, unless you make it with a const like that, if you do make it with a const, you can't change the length. All right, but if you make it with a let, you can change the length. You can, or a var, but you shouldn't use vars. All right, so you can make it bigger, smaller. And again, one of the things about an array in JavaScript, and this shouldn't be new to any of you, even though all the examples they show in here are either numbers or strings or whatever, you can mix. So you can have an array that has both numbers, strings, booleans, dates, etc. It's totally legit to do that. All right. So again, they've got some examples here. That shouldn't be really anything new to any of you. All right. And, like I said, the one that I did, the one that I just showed you, it works. And it's totally fine. All right. Now, that's almost the way you would have done it when you think about it when we were working in C#. The difference is we would have probably said int there, and these would have been curly braces. But if we did it like that, that's pretty much the same way we've always done it. So it's not like there's really anything new here. All right, like I said, I don't want to waste time on stuff that I think you already know. So, yeah, if you have to go back and review this stuff, cool. Okay, no big thing. Remember now, if you create this, now they're saying this, and they're even saying you can add an element to an array that is a const. I will just tell you, I've done it and have it work, and I've done it and had it not work. All right, const is a weird animal. So if you think that you are going to be dealing with something that will be changing over time, I'd say don't use const. Make it a let. I would have used let in their examples there. They didn't do it. All right. Now, one nice thing about doing this, as they show right there, okay, this is element 0, element 1, and element 2, but you know as well as I do, looking at that top example, that there are 3 elements in the array. So you can always say the name of the array dot length when you want to set a new element. All right, and when you do that, it always goes on the end. That's not the only way that you can do it. All right. For instance, when you look at that line that's right here, just to show you this, I'm going to, there we go. We could have done this too, even though it may not look that great, but where they've got this right here, right there, that one. We could have also said there, const numbers. I'm going to leave, the first part will be the same, equal 1, 2, comma 3. All right. And then we could have said underneath it, instead of saying numbers, and this is totally legit, numbers.length equal 4. That's totally fine. But we could have also said numbers.push 4. And that would have done the same thing. It would have put, in both cases, the array would now hold 1, 2, 3, 4. Does that make sense? All right. One way to quickly remove all elements from an array is to set the length to 0. that actually is the easiest way. If you've got an array with 1,000,000 elements in it, and you say, you know, with 1,000,000 numbers in it, you say numbers.length equals 0, boom. All right. You can also create sparse arrays in this language. Now, as they show in the example there, now array element numbers 0, numbers sub 0 would be equal to 1. Numbers sub 1 through numbers sub 999 would all be undefined. You can do that. I mean, there may be a really valid reason for doing something like that. Typically not that big, but if I've got a bunch of students, and let's just say that I've got 10 students, and for whatever reason 5 didn't take a test that day, I might want to do something along those lines. I don't know. And again, that's referred to as being a sparse array. Now, kind of weird, but there are a bunch of different loops that you can use with arrays. Now, one thing about this, and you'll see this in just a second, these loops that they're going to talk about in here, not the for, but the for in and the for of, which are both going to be shown here, are meant to be used on what are called collections. And a collection is basically, it's a data structure. So it's not meant to be used with just simple variables, with primitives, okay? Now, we've all done stuff like this when we used a regular for loop. And regardless of what you think, good, bad, or indifferent, about using these different loops, all right, because you're going to see a couple of them in here. Typically, again, I know the question got asked last week, well, you know, well, why should we use these? Because it results in less code, all right? And typically, it is at least supposed to execute faster. It executes faster because there's less code, all right? But what they're showing here is this example that's right here, all right, which is with a regular for loop, which we have been using, is the same as the one that's shown right here. So what's the difference? Well, you don't have to say let I equal 0, and you don't have to test it. And you don't have to increment it. When you come in here and you do this, it's doing all that for you. So when you say const I equals names, all right, what you're doing basically, for lack of better, or in names I should say, what you're doing is you're initializing it to 0, it's iterating its way through the array, and as it goes from one element to the other, it automatically increments it, and it stops when it gets to the end. All right, now you might look at that and say, you know what, I get this one, I sort of get what this is, but I get this one, I just want to keep using it. You can. There is nothing wrong with using the standard for loop that we learned first semester. This is just meant to make it a little bit easier for you. And notice there is a for in and there is a for of. The for in loop by default is designed to work with indexes. All right? The for of loop is designed to work with values. All right? They work almost the same way. They look almost the same. Here we have got const I in names. Here we got const val in names. All right? So here we're telling it to grab what's at that index. Here we're telling it to just grab the value itself. Okay? So as it says, because this is a pretty decent explanation, you can use any of the 3 for loops to iterate through an array. You can still use a while loop. You can still use a do while loop. Again, the advantage of using for loops is that typically you know the size of the array. All right, that's why you usually use it. As it says, you can use a constant or a variable with a for in or a for of to refer to the element index, with the for in or the element value with the for of. All right, as it says, by contrast, the counter in a for statement must be a let. So this one has to be, when we do this one, that has to be a let. You can't make that a const because it is iterating its way through. On these, since it kind of does it but behind the scenes, since it's built in, you don't need it. You can make this a const. You can make this a const. All right. Could I still make them a let? I guess if you wanted to, you could. All right. One of the things they've tried to do as ECMA has gone on and on, the European Computer Manufacturers Association, with JavaScript, is if they had their way, everything in the world would be a const. Consts execute and work faster, and they're typically less problematic than lets. Lets work faster and are less problematic than vars. All right. So as they mention here then, the constant or variable that's declared in a for in is the index of the current element, whereas the constant or variable with the for of is the value of the current element. All right. All right. Now, I try to point these things out, and this is, there's nothing wrong with this section, except it's not exactly the way we're going to use it. But you have to start learning about the term destructure. All right, we're going to be looking at that when we get into the node stuff. When you destructure something, as you probably guess, if you structure it, you're kind of putting it together. When you're destructuring it, you're kind of taking it apart. All right? So, as it says there, JavaScript allows you to assign multiple array elements to multiple constants or variables without using indexes. This is called destructuring an array. Now they're going to show an example. I think this was the one that was right here. All right. So when you look right here, notice what we have. Assign the first three elements in an array. Totals would now hold this and this and this. Does that make sense to everybody? All right. That is the destructuring. You can also set individual values that way. And again, you might say, well, that's fine, but why would you want to do that? Because if you want to be able to treat the values in an array separately, maybe you want to do different things to different values, that's why you would destructure them. All right. Notice here they're saying if you want to skip an element. So we've got Grace M. Hopper. We want to skip the M. We still have to account for it, so we just put in a comma. It's not even mandatory there. You could have just said first name, comma, comma, last name with no spaces, and it would have worked okay. Typically you do it like this because it's easier to read. You can use default values with this stuff. We've talked about this before. Not just in this language, but we've talked about default values in C#, for example. Remember, if you use default values like they show here in example 3, the default values must be on the end. So in other words, if first was going to have a default value, you would have to, and you wanted to put it first like this, you'd have to provide one for middle, last, and suffix as well. All right. And as they say there, you can also destructure a string. What a string is, if you don't know this, a string is a character array. So really, if you've got USA, then, you know, in here, that's the 0th element, that's the 1 element, and that's the 2 element. All right, not so much in this language, but in a lot of other languages, you end up doing a lot of that stuff. All right. So as it says, you can assign the elements in an array to individual constants and variables, either with const or let. Again, known as destructuring. When you destructure the array, you can skip elements. Just showed you that. All right. A couple of the things that we're going to be looking at before the end of this class. Two of the most important things in what's referred to as ECMA 6, which is pretty much about 5 years old. But when they started making additions to what you can do with arrays, is they created what's called the rest operator, and they created what's called the spread operator. And it's confusing because both of them look the same. All right. They all have the 3 dots in there. And the 3 dots basically represent, you typically use those to represent all or part of an array. All right. Notice as it says, they were introduced in ECMA 2015, thus they can't be used with older browsers. Okay. All right. So they've got some more stuff in here. This should be stuff that you know, because we did talk about this stuff in the first semester. You might not remember it, but we did talk about this in the first semester. When you push something onto an array, you push it onto the end. All right? When you pop something from an array, you pop it from the end. The opposite of push and pop are shift and unshift. All right, so whereas push adds something to the end of an array, unshift adds something to the beginning of an array. Whereas pop removes the last element in the array, shift removes the first element in an array. Does that make sense? Now, can you also remove other elements? Yes, but not with push, pop, shift, or unshift. There you typically use slice or splice, and those are shown on here too. All right. Now, all of these, by default, when you do this, typically when you use not slice, but all the other ones. So when you use push, pop, unshift, shift, or splice, the idea is you don't change the value of the original array. All right. You take what you want and you put it into another array. And again, these are not the only ways of doing this. All right. Another popular way of doing this now is to use what's called the map function. And we are going to look at map at the end of the chapter here. Now, notice the last one that's here, slice, returns a new array. All right. That starts with the index given to it, etc. That one is designed. Typically it changes it. All right, so when we look at the examples here, I don't really like their examples, but that's the ones that they're using. All right, it's not going to make a heck of a lot of sense until you go over those. Methods that inspect an array or its elements. Again, I'm not going to read any of these to you, but let's just talk about some of the new ones. All right. Really, the first two are not new. All right. The third one is new. Includes. It'll go through an array and it'll check for the presence or absence of something. So if I've got an array of names, and let's say my name is in there, and I say the name of the array dot includes, and then I put in parentheses, double quote Jeff, double quote, and I'm in there, it returns true. If I'm not in there, it returns false. All right. Okay. Find, as it says, returns the value of the first element that meets a condition. So if there were a lot of Jeffs in there, let's say, it would return just the first one. Not only can you use find, as it says there, you can use find index. So find will return, yes, I mean, it'll return the value if there is one. Find index will return where it is in the array. And if it doesn't exist in the array, it returns -1. All right. Now, filter is a new one. Returns an array containing the elements that meet the condition of the function. Typically, what you do when you use filter is you use one array to create another array. All right. So, for instance, let's say that I had, I don't know, let's say that I had an array that had all sorts of stuff in it. You're going to see that. In fact, I can just show you one of these examples. So we've got this array right here. Now, this is an array. How do I know that? Because it's got these things. And I went a little bit ahead because when you look at this, if you put these in curly braces, these are objects. All right. So I've got objects, and I didn't make first name, last name. I just made name. So you notice we've got name, department, when they started, and when they end. Does that make sense? So it's an object with 4 different fields in it. Those end dates are made up. All right. But the idea is what you are able to do is, let's say I wanted to go through here, and all I wanted to do was pluck out the name. I didn't care about what department they were in, when they started, etc. All right. Or I could pull out just the name and the department as an example. So again, you're going to see a bunch of those as we go on in here. All right. Then we've got every. It says it returns a Boolean. So let's say in here, in the example that I'd shown you earlier in here, if I'd run every on there and I wanted my check was, is every value less than 100? They all are, so it would return true. If one of these, so I mean if that was in there, it would return false. Does that make sense to everybody? All right. So it's a fast way to iterate your way through an array to see whether or not everything that's in that array meets a condition that you've provided. All right. Maybe you don't care about all of them. Maybe you just care that one or more meet that criteria. That's sum. So the difference between every and sum, they both return a Boolean, but every returns true only when every single array element meets the condition you've set out, whereas sum returns true if any meet the condition that you've set out. All right. Now these, I'm not going to lie to you, I probably don't use them very often, but they are important. Entries, as it says, returns an iterator that contains a key value for each array element. The key is the index. Well, who cares? I mean, if I had 15 students, the first student in there would be student 0, second one student 1, etc. But what you'll see in a couple minutes is one thing that's fairly new in JavaScript is you can now create what are called associative arrays. All right, and we may have looked at this in another class. I don't know. But if I did this, if I said const Midwest equals, and I just put in here Missouri, Illinois, we'll put in 2 more, Wisconsin, and Iowa. All right. You should all know that by default, putting that in like that is the same thing as saying Midwest 0 equal Missouri, and just imagine I put the rest in. Okay? And that's totally fine to do that. But what you can also do now when you are setting these up is you can set them up as key value pairs. What do I mean? I'm just going to come in here and all I'm going to do is say const Midwest equal, and I'm going to put in like that, just for now. So I've got an empty array. Now I'm going to come in and say Midwest, oops, no, not that. Midwest, and I'm going to change this to MO equals Missouri. And again, just pretend I put the rest in there. And I can make them capitals. It doesn't really matter one way or the other. But that's what's referred to as an associative array, because instead of using numbers for indices, you use strings. And it's much easier typically, and it depends, but if you're working with just strings, a lot of times people will use and set up an associative array because the key value makes a lot of sense. Here, the key doesn't make a lot of sense to most people. I mean, if I had all 50 states in there and I asked you alphabetically which one is Missouri, maybe you know. I don't have any idea because I've never had to care. All right, I know Alabama's first. All right, and I think, what is it? It's not Wisconsin. Wyoming, I think, is last. All right, that's about all I can tell you. So when you want to work with those values and with those keys, you can use the values and the keys. You can use them separately or in conjunction with one another. Finally, as it says, is array, a static method that returns a Boolean value that indicates whether or not the specified object is an array. The key word in there is static. What that means is you don't have to create something new. You can check something that already exists with it. All right? All right, methods that transform the elements. I'm going to go over these, but most of the ones in here, not every one, but a lot of the ones that are in here, I've got in the examples, in that example file for you. All right. Now, notice for each, kind of neat because for each is another way of doing a for loop. Now, what's different about it? Notice it executes a function once for each element and it returns a value of undefined. Well, what's important there is not the returning the undefined, but that it executes once for each element. So you don't use a for each if there's a chance that you want to have a break or a continue inside of the loop. Because a for each is designed to go through the entire array. All right. There's join. As it says, join converts all the elements of an array to strings and concatenates them by separating them with commas or whatever. All right. And then you've got the opposite of that. All right. And we're going to we'll get to that in a minute. The toString method, I don't use it very much in JavaScript. You use it all the time next semester in Java. You use toString all over the place. All right. Sort works fine, except I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but if I were to sort these numbers that are right here, all right, probably what you guess is it would give me 1 first. What you probably wouldn't guess is typically it would give me 13 second and it would give me 17 third, and then it would come up and find 23 and whoop, there's a 2 in there. 23, 23, like that. And that's because by default, it's attempting to do not a numeric sort, but it's, for lack of better words, almost attempting to do a string sort. And 1 comes before 2. All right? And again, you'll see some of those when you run through the examples in just a bit. It's very easy to fix that. It's no big thing. All right? And again, I think we did this first semester. So this will sort numbers by default, all right, in alphabetic, or numeric ascending order. And if you run sort and then you run reverse, it's the same thing as doing a descending sort. Many programming languages have a sort like and an R sort for reverse sort. This is not one of those languages. All right. Map, as it says, executes a function once for each element and returns an array that contains the results of each function call. I'm going to go through a bunch of these, and I've got some map examples that you'll see in a little bit. Reduce, as it says, executes a function and returns all the elements reduced to 1 value. So if I wanted to, for example, and there's multiple ways of doing this, but let's pretend for just a second that for some reason I needed to get the sum of all of these. I could use the reduce method to do that. You're going to see an example of that in just a few minutes. All right. Flat and flat map, as it says, returns an array with any nested array elements included. All right. And flat map returns an array with the results of a functional call. What that typically will be used for is, depending on what you're doing and how you're doing it, if you add an array to an existing array, and you don't do it the right way, then rather than having element 1, then element 2, then element 3, now if I add a new array the wrong way, it puts the whole array in there as 1 element. All right, if you don't know what I mean, just keep listening in the chapter. I think they'll show an example. But if you don't want that to happen, you can flatten it, and that's what they're talking about here. All right. So again, next they go through their test scores application, which, as I said, I'm not going to go through. And it's not that it's not a good application. It's not that there's anything wrong with it. They do have some of the stuff in here. Notice there's a reverse, there's a slice, etc. Take a look at it if you get some time. All right. Okay, how to split a string into an array. Okay, so split's the opposite of join. As it says, splits a string into an array. All right, but there has to be some way of knowing. So for instance, right here, there's a blank between each one. So if I ran split on this based on the blank, in name parts 0 would be Grace, name parts 1 would be M, name parts 2 would be Hopper, as an example. All right. You can split on almost anything as long as there is something to split on. So here they've taken a date and they're splitting it based on the parts of the date. So as it says, the split method of a string object can split a string into an array. If the string doesn't include a separator, it returns the entire string and makes it just a one-element array. Might be a reason for doing that. And finally, as it says, if the separator is an empty string, again, it returns an array where each character is an element in the array. All right. Different ways of making copies. Okay, they show right here 4 different ways of making a copy of an existing array. And I will tell you, probably you'll know once you start doing it as far as what the easiest way is. All right, let's just take a look at these. So you've got this thing of names and you want to make a copy of it. You can just say the name dot slice, not a problem. You can use the array from, not a problem. But when you look right here, notice in one case, in here with the rest, the dot 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 is on the left-hand side of the equal sign, and with the spread, the dot 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 is on the right-hand side of the equal sign. So you use rest when you're assigning something, and you use spread basically when you're setting something. And I don't think I said it backwards, but it'll say it right in here. The last of the 2 bullets at the bottom. You use the spread operator to spread out the elements of an array into a comma-separated list. Then you can use that list in an array literal that assigns the values to a new array. Like rest, spread was introduced in 2015, so it can't be used with older browsers. The associative array I already mentioned to you. All right, so take a look at the example here and notice they've created an empty array called item. Then they're setting the code, the name, the cost, and the quantity. All right, and again, it's probably a little bit more work, but what it will do as far as setup, but once you are running the program, it makes your program much more self-documenting. All right, which is a reason that some people choose to use it. You can have an array of arrays, and what's an array of arrays? All right, it's at a minimum, it's a 2-dimensional array. All right, so again, if you know how to use the spreadsheet, you already know how to use a 2-dimensional array. It's rows and columns. All right, so rows are always the one listed first, columns are always the one that are listed second. That's just the way that it works. You can have arrays to any dimension you want. And as they say in here, although JavaScript doesn't provide for multi-dimensional arrays, you can get the same effect by creating an array of arrays. Just like for a 3-dimensional, it would be an array of arrays of arrays. All right, and you can do that as many times as you need to. And as they mentioned, be careful when you do that because your code can become hard to read and maintain. Well, it's not just that it's hard to read or maintain, but again, I think we've talked about this before, that if people can't in their mind fathom what something looks like, I mean, I've never used a 5-dimensional array. I've never had a reason to do so. All right. Another important part of this chapter, another thing worth reading, is the next couple pages. All right, because one of the things we're going to be going into, if not at the end of this week, at the beginning of next week, is to talk about JSON. Much of the work that we're going to be doing this semester is going to involve us using JSON, JavaScript object notation. And there's a couple different methods that you use with this, and they are stringify and parse, which you're going to see on the next page. All right. But it says before you can store an array in web storage, you need to convert it to a string. Later, when you get it from web storage, you need to put it back into an array. So you're going back and forth. So as they say there, in the olden days, developers had to write their own code to perform these conversions. But now there's JSON, and as it says, JSON comes with two static methods. Stringify, that allows you to convert an object, like an array, into JSON, all right? And going the other way, basically, with parse, which allows you to store the data back into an object, all right? So if you're going from object to string, it's stringify, which sort of makes sense. And if you're going from string back to object, it's parse. And they mention, although the JS and JSON stands for JavaScript, JSON is used in almost every programming language. We did not use it in C#, but we could have. In fact, if the C# class changes, if not this year, next year, to the way I told you it might, we will. So they've got a couple of examples in here, and again, there are the two methods, stringify and parse. Now, what we will end up doing when we get into talking about Node is we will add some what's called middleware. And it's literally one line of code where we say, hey, basically allow yourself to work with JSON, and then we can work with it. So there's not a whole heck of a lot to it. So as I said, it's just a few pages, but I take a look at this. As mentioned here, JSON is a format that uses text to store and transmit data or an object. All right, originally based on the notation for objects, originally by JavaScript, but now used almost language-wide. When using the parse method, as it says, to convert a string back into an object, okay, it says you may need to call the constructor of the object again. That's not a big thing for us right now. You can use the stringify and parse, as it says, to work with most types of native JavaScript objects and user-defined objects that you create. Oops. All right, then they go back and they rewrite this task application again. All right, just about finished here. So the rest of the chapter talks about sets and it talks about maps. All right. If I put a bunch of, let's take a look at this example that I showed here. If I use that example that's right there, okay, you'll notice that every number is unique in there except the number 23 is in there twice. All right. So if I made a set out of this, what it would do is it would grab every number that's in there, but it would throw out any duplicates. That's the idea behind a set. So the 23 would be gone. I'd have one less element than what is shown here, in other words. And that's what they explain in here. And sometimes using an array is not enough. So you want to actually create a set. You might look at this and say, you know what, everything they're showing in there I could do in an array, and you probably could. Right? But sometimes, see, the advantage when you look through here is the set has some methods that aren't directly available in the array. Some of them are like size, where an array uses length. All right? But and you can read the rest. I'm not going to read them to you. All right? The big one here are the bottom two of these values and keys, because that's, again, what you're pretty much creating. So as said here, a set can store 0 or more elements where each element has a unique value. To create a set, you use the set constructor, which accepts an optional array value. If the array contains duplicates, as it says, they get removed. A set has less functionality than an array, but you can also convert a set to an array. So there are functions that you can run on that to do that. All right. Unlike the elements of a set, as it says, where each must be unique, the elements of a map are pairs of keys and values, where each key must be unique, but each value must not be unique. I kind of look at a map as, I've used this example before, is like a dictionary. You might be able to look up two different words in the dictionary and they might have exactly the same definition, but the words themselves are different. And the words are the keys and the definitions are the values. In the same way here, each key must be unique, but the values that go inside, if necessary, can be the same. And you'll notice that these are almost, if not the exact same methods for maps that we just looked at for keys. All right. So as mentioned right there, a map can store one or more elements consisting of key value pairs. All right, the key for each pair must be unique, but not the value. And that's it. Now, what I want you to do, if you would please, is to open up the file that I sent you. We're going to take a break in just a minute, but I just want to show you how to use this, for lack of better words. All right. What I'm going to do, I'm going to try to make it as easy on myself as possible. So I'm going to come in to Visual Studio Code right here. And I'm not going to create a folder. I'm not going to create anything except I'm going to come in here and in Visual Studio Code, this is interesting because this is an older version I'm using here. All right, I have no folder open, so I'm going to do a file, new file. I'm just going to create a new file in here. All right, and I'm going to do a file, save as, and I'm just going to call it index.html, and I'm going to save it right to my desktop. You don't even have to do this if you don't want to. You can open up one of your existing files. The advantage of opening up this one is if for some reason I were to happen to come in here and destroy it, it's no harm. Does that make sense? All right. So this is all I did was I hit the exclamation point and tab to put in the HTML template. All right. And now I'm going to save this. You all know this already. I'm preaching to the choir, so to speak here. But I can now come in here. I can right mouse click and I can open this with Live Server. And the thing that's kind of nice about it is it's going to be an empty file when it eventually opens, or if it opened. There's really not going to be anything in there. Again, I can also always come in here and do it like this as well if for some reason I want to. I can double click on it like that. But there's nothing in here because I didn't put anything in here. But what I want you to see is I want you to do this. That is right mouse click and choose inspect. We've looked at this before. There isn't anything new in there except what we're going to be using a lot is console. So I'm bringing up the console here. I'm going to drag up so it's taking up a lot of room on my screen. I don't care about the rest. So this is my console area in here. All right. Now, the way that you should do this, and it might be easier to bring up one of your files. Let me just quickly show you the difference here. If I go and bring up, so here I've got this class project, and if I click the MPG file, and I right mouse click and I choose inspect, see how it separates it into two? I can drag this way over if I want to, and come back in here and find console. It's going to do pretty much the same thing. All right. But I want to walk you through what's in here. So I'll tell you what, it's 1 o'clock. Let's come back at 1:15. I will walk you through this file and how it's used and what I want you to do with it and what I hope you get out of it. All right, so let's take a break and we'll continue on then.